King Charles looked directly at the royal guard and said the words that made everyone freeze. "Remove him from post and place him under arrest." The handcuffs clicked. The crowd fell silent. And that's when the guard finally spoke. What he revealed in the next 60 seconds didn't just save his career, it reminded a king why he was still alive to give that order in the first place. "You know that particular kind of London cold that gets into your bones and makes you wish you'd stayed in bed?" That's exactly what it was like outside St. James's Palace that January morning. The kind of sharp, bitter air that turns your breath into little puffs of steam and makes every sound carry twice as far. The frost hadn't just settled on the palace railings, it had claimed them completely, turning the black wrought iron into something that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. Even the Union Jack hanging above the main entrance seemed to snap with more attitude than usual, like it was putting on a show for the cold. But none of that stopped the small crowd from gathering behind the rope barriers, maybe 30 people, bundled up in wool coats and scarves, phones already out. Because when you're visiting London in January and there's a chance of seeing royalty, you take what you can get. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness something that would make every other royal moment seem tame by comparison. Staff Sergeant Alistair Grant stood third from the archway, and if you saw him from across the courtyard, you'd think he was carved from the same stone as the palace behind him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from ceremony training, it comes from places where moving at the wrong time could get you killed. 22 years he'd been doing this, not just the ceremonial stuff. That was only the part people saw. The real work happened in places with names that made the evening news under circumstances that never made it into the official reports. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, 6 months in Syria that officially never happened. He'd been handpicked for close protection details precisely because he could read situations that others miss. The way a crowd moved, the way someone held their shoulders when they were carrying weight they shouldn't have, the difference between nervous energy and predatory calculation. His commanding officer had once written in his evaluation, "Grant possesses an almost supernatural ability to identify threats before they materialize. His tactical awareness has prevented more incidents than he'll ever be credited for." That evaluation was classified, filed in a folder most people would never see, but standing there in his scarlet tunic, polished boots reflecting the winter sky, he looked like nothing more than a very expensive tourist attraction. The red tunic fit him like it had been painted on, every button in perfect alignment, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. The tall black bearskin had cast shadows across his face, but not enough to hide those steady gray eyes that had seen more than most people twice his age. Behind those barriers, a middle-aged woman was explaining to her teenage daughter how the ceremony worked. "See, they stand perfectly still no matter what happens. It's been that way for centuries." Her daughter rolled her eyes. "It's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? All this pomp and circumstance." What neither of them knew was that the man they were looking at had once carried his dying sergeant for miles through Taliban territory. Guard duty under mortar fire in Syria had made split-second decisions that saved lives in places where the wrong call meant body bags coming home. But here in the forecourt, he was just another figure in red until everything went sideways. The palace doors opened with that heavy ceremonial weight that only comes from centuries of tradition. King Charles emerged, flanked by military brass, his navy overcoat buttoned high against the cold. He was here for a closed military briefing, but protocol demanded he review the guard first. The inspection started normally enough. Charles moved down the line with measured steps, offering small nods here, brief words there, the kind of formal acknowledgement that keeps ceremonial wheels turning smoothly. Behind the barriers, an American tourist whispered to his wife, "This is pretty cool, very formal." His wife nodded, already taking photos. "Look how they don't even blink. It's like they're not real people." If only she knew. Charles approached Grant with the same measured pace he'd used for the others. A quick glance up and down, a small nod, then onward, standard operating procedure, except as he took his next step, an aide in a dark overcoat leaned in from the side. The man's voice was pitched low, but in that sharp January air, sound carried differently than usual. Phrases drifted across the courtyard like smoke. "Incident with the vehicle movement last week. and refused a direct order, and security treating it as a breach. They continued. His words becoming more urgent, he physically blocked the service entrance, sir, forced a complete operational halt, 3 hours behind schedule. The security team is calling it gross insubordination, possibly grounds for court-martial. Charles's aide glanced nervously at the crowd, clearly uncomfortable discussing classified matters in public. The vehicle in question was carrying catering supplies for tomorrow's diplomatic reception. Grant's actions created a significant security incident and violated direct orders from his superior officer. What the aide didn't mention, what was buried in classified reports, was that Grant's insubordination had uncovered a bombing ploy that would have killed dozens of people, including the king himself. Charles stopped walking, not dramatically, not with any grand gesture. He just stopped. The kind of stillness that makes everyone around you suddenly realize something's changed. Behind the barriers, conversations died mid-sentence. The American tourist lowered his camera slightly. "What's happening?" His wife shushed him, but her eyes never left the scene unfolding in front of them. Charles turned slightly toward the senior officer, trailing behind him a brigadier whose chest was decorated with enough medals to stock a jewelry store. "Move him from post," Charles said, his voice carrying just far enough for the courtyard to hear, "and place him under arrest for gross misconduct." The reaction was immediate and electric. Behind the rope, people started murmuring. A few phones rose higher, suddenly capturing something far more interesting than a routine ceremony. "Did he just say arrest?" someone whispered. "What did the guard do?" came another voice. The brigadier didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Majesty." The palace NCO stepped forward from the perimeter, moving with that crisp efficiency that comes from years of following orders without question. They approached Grant from either side, their boots echoing on the wet stone. Through it all, Grant didn't move, not a twitch, not even a blink. His rifle caught a sliver of pale winter light as one of the NCOs reached for it, sliding it from his shoulder with practiced ease. The American woman behind the barrier grabbed her husband's arm. "They're actually arresting him right here in front of everyone." Her husband was already filming. "This is insane. What could he have possibly done?" From somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, "Why, what's he done?" Charles didn't look toward the voice. His attention stayed fixed on the unfolding arrest, projecting the kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of being listened to without question. "Our uniform," he said, the words deliberate and clear, "is not a shield for defiance." The NCO on Grant's right reached for his arm. There was the soft jingle of keys, then the sharp, unmistakable click of handcuffs locking around her wrist. That sound cut through the January air like a blade. Someone in the crowd drew a sharp breath. A woman near the back pressed her hand to her mouth. "This isn't right." A voice called out from the civilian section. An older man with a military bearing stepped closer to the rope. That man served with honor. A younger woman near the front was already typing frantically on her phone. "This is going live on every news channel in 10 minutes, she muttered to her companion. Behind the barriers, a teenage boy tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, why are they arresting the soldier?" His father's face was grim. "I don't know, son, but something tells me we're about to find out." Grant's left wrist was drawn back. The second cuff closed with another decisive snap that seemed to echo off the palace walls. A photographer's flash went off, capturing the moment when ceremony turned into something nobody had expected to witness. That's when everything changed. For the first time since Charles had given the order, Grant spoke. His voice was calm, steady, almost conversational despite the steel biting into his wrists. "Your Majesty," he said, "one truth before you take me away." The NCOs paused, their hands still gripping Grant's elbows. They'd received their orders. But there was something in the way he'd spoken, not defiant, not angry, just certain, that made them hesitate. Charles's eyes narrowed slightly. "You will speak where it belongs, Staff Sergeant, at an inquiry, not in front of an audience." The cameras were rolling now, journalists leaning forward to catch every word. The crowd had gone from curious to captivated, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Grant's gaze met the king's directly across the thin space between them. "This truth concerns you, and the day your life almost ended." The effect was immediate. The nearby dignitaries stiffened like they'd been touched by electricity. A couple of veterans in the viewing area stopped murmuring entirely. Even the brigadier's head snapped toward the king, reading his reaction. Behind the barriers, the American tourist whispered to his wife, "Did he just threaten the king?" "I don't think so," she replied, but her voice was uncertain. It sounded like something else. Charles's lips pressed together, his gloved hands clasping behind his back. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing something heavier than protocol. "Move him along," he told the NCOs, but there was a hesitation now, a beat too long that everyone noticed. Grant's shoulders stayed square as they began to guide him forward. The red wool of his tunic stood out vividly against the gray stone, a splash of ceremony in the middle of something nobody could quite believe they were seeing. "If I'm silenced here, Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "you'll never know why I broke that order, and you'll never know why you're standing here to give it." The murmurs swelled into something closer to actual conversation. Visitors leaned against the rope, phones held high. The woman who'd been explaining ceremony to her daughter was now staring with her mouth slightly open. "This is mental," someone whispered. "He's really doing this." The NCO on Grant's left glanced at the brigadier, confusion written across his face. The order to move had been given, but nobody wanted to be the one dragging a decorated veteran across the forecourt mid-sentence, especially not in front of cameras that were broadcasting this live to God knows where. Charles studied Grant's face like he was trying to read a map written in a foreign language. The crowd sensed the shift the moment when ceremony gave way to something far more human and complicated. From the veterans section near the east wall, a gravelly voice called out, "Let him speak." Another echoed it, and then a few more voices joined in, creating a wave of sound that pressure washed the formality right out of the moment. The resting NCOs stood frozen, their hands still locked on Grant's elbows, but their eyes flicking between the brigadier and the king like they were watching a tennis match. Charles stood very still, his shoulders drawn back, weighing something more complex than royal protocol. The circle of advisors around him leaned inward, some whispering about optics, others calculating how this would look on the evening news. "Sir," the brigadier ventured quietly, "there are recordings." He didn't need to explain that those recordings would be on social media before lunch. Charles's jaw worked once, and then he lifted a hand, a small gesture, but enough to freeze the NCOs in place. He stepped closer to Grant, his polished shoes clicking softly on the damp stone. "You have 1 minute," he said at last. "One." The change in atmosphere was instant and profound. It was like someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. A cough from the back of the crowd carried like it had been amplified. Grant didn't nod or thank him. He just took one slow breath, his cuffed hands settling in front of him, the chain catching the pale light. When he spoke, his voice was steady enough to reach every person in that courtyard. "This isn't about defiance," he said. "It's about what I saw and what I've seen before." Every eye was on him now, the king's most of all. Grant's gaze never wavered from Charles's face as he continued. "Helmand Province, 2009. You remember the visit no one was supposed to know about. No press, no crowds, no fanfare, just you, a skeleton escort, and the kind of heat that makes you question your life choices." The king's eyes sharpened, and you could see the memory starting to surface like something rising from deep water. "I was in the lead Land Rover," Grant continued, "running security sweep for your convoy. Halfway to the forward base, our radio picked up chatter, to bursts of Pashto, garbled by static. Wrong frequency, but I recognized the voice. Taliban spotter. We'd been hunting for months." He shifted his cuffed wrists slightly, the metal biting in, but his expression never changing. "Hassan al-Zarqawi. We had photos of him on every briefing board. He'd been tracking coalition movements for 6 months, responsible for 3 AD attacks that killed 11 soldiers. And there he was, calling in coordinates that matched our exact route." A veteran in the crowd straightened his shoulders, recognizing the weight of what he was hearing. "I told my CO we needed to change route immediately. He said we didn't have clearance to deviate, that the convoy's timing and location were locked in stone. I told him that sticking to that road was going to get everyone killed. Behind the barriers, people had stopped taking photos. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was testimony." The answer was still no, Protocol was protocol, but I could hear Al Zarqawi in my earpiece. And I knew what those coordinates meant, so I made a decision, swung us down a side track toward the dry riverbed, and signaled the others to follow. My CO was screaming in my earpiece, telling me I'd just ended my career and compromised the entire operation. I kept driving. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, suddenly understanding they were hearing about life and death decisions made in places most of them couldn't imagine. We reached the base 27 minutes late, and that original route, Grant paused, letting the silence build. Our bomb disposal lads found it an hour later, rigged end-to-end with 200 pounds of explosives, enough to turn every vehicle in that convoy into confetti. The crowd was utterly still now, hanging on every word. Command estimated the blast would have been visible from 12 kilometers away. The Taliban had been planning it for weeks, timing everything perfectly for your arrival. If we'd been on that road when it detonated, Grant let the sentence hang and finished. A journalist in the press section was frantically taking notes, already calculating the international implications of what she was hearing. The incident was classified immediately. Grant continued, "Officially, your visit was routine and uneventful. The press was told you'd inspected equipment and met with troops. No mention of explosives, no mention of alternative routes, no mention of the 23 Taliban fighters we arrested in the following sweep." His voice grew quieter, but somehow more forceful. "I was debriefed by intelligence officers for 6 hours. Told that revealing any details of what happened would violate the Official Secrets Act and endanger future operations. I signed papers, agreeing never to discuss it, and I've honored that silence for 16 years. Grant's voice dropped, but somehow carried even further. "You were in the last car of that convoy, Your Majesty, traveling without insignia, without ceremony, without anyone knowing you were there except the people who wanted you dead." An elderly woman in the crowd had tears streaming down her face. A man pulled out his phone, then looked at it and put it away without recording. Some moments were too important to watch through a screen. I was told afterward I'd be thanked in private, and that the incident was never to be discussed again. And I've kept that promise until today. He straightened his shoulders, the handcuffs catching the light. This week, when I refused that palace vehicle order, it was because I recognized the same signs: an invented delivery van loitering near the gate, wrong plates, wrong weight for the manifest, driver who kept checking his watch instead of his paperwork. Grant's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath it now. I radioed for additional screening, was told there wasn't time, the schedule was already tight, and delaying the arrival would cascade through the entire day's events. But that van had been circling the perimeter for 20 minutes, and the driver's behavior matched every suicide bomber profile I'd ever studied. An intelligence officer in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, probably running the same threat assessment calculations in his head. So I made the call, blocked the vehicle's approach until explosive detection teams could sweep it properly. Found traces of fertilizer compound in the cargo bay and a remote detonation device hidden in the dashboard. The driver disappeared the moment he saw our dogs approaching. Grant's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried to every corner of the courtyard. The device was designed to detonate when the van reached the main kitchen entrance, exactly where your morning tea services are prepared, Your Majesty. The blast radius would have taken out the entire east wing. Intelligence estimates between 40 and 60 casualties, including kitchen staff, security personnel, and anyone unfortunate enough to be in the corridor at the time. A palace cook standing near the service entrance went pale, her hand rising instinctively to her throat. The fertilizer compound, same signature as the Manchester Arena bombing, same as the London Bridge attacks. We're not talking about amateurs here. This was a coordinated operation with international connections. An intelligence officer in the crowd was already on his phone, probably alerting counterterrorism units to begin immediate investigations. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but now they were edged with understanding rather than confusion. If that's misconduct, then I stand guilty, but it's the same guilt that kept you breathing 16 years ago, and it's the same guilt that might keep you breathing tomorrow. The words hung in the January air like smoke that wouldn't disperse. For several heartbeats, King Charles didn't speak. The forecourt, frozen in that impossible-to-blow-of-ceremony meeting reality, seemed to hold its breath. The king's gaze stayed locked on Grant, searching for something in his face. You could see him processing, remembering, weighing truth against protocol, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The tight line of his jaw softened, a few dignitaries shifted. Uncomfortably, one of the visiting generals was staring at the ground, probably replaying his own memories of those years. The only sound was the wind sliding over stone and metal like a whispered reminder of how cold the world could be. Finally, Charles stepped forward, not much. Just enough to close the space between them by a single pace. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly. Both times, he paused, and when he continued, there was something different in his tone. "And both times, you may have saved my life." The reaction was immediate. Gasps swept through the crowd like wind through wheat. A woman lowered her phone entirely, no longer interested in recording. The resting NCOs looked at each other with expressions that suggested they'd rather be anywhere else. In the press section, a BBC correspondent was already calculating how this story would dominate headlines for weeks. Behind the rope barriers, conversations erupted in hushed, urgent tones. "Did you just hear there was a bomb plot this week?" someone whispered. "How many times has this happened that we never heard about?" Came another voice. A retired military officer near the front shook his head in amazement. "That man's probably prevented more attacks than we'll ever know about, and they were going to arrest him for it." The American tourist turned to his wife, his voice filled with awe. "We just watched a king learn that someone saved his life twice, and he had no idea either time." Even the palace staff looked stunned. Security officials were exchanging urgent glances, probably wondering what other threats they'd missed, what other judgments they'd questioned. Charles turned toward the senior officer beside him. "Release him." There was a moment's hesitation, centuries of protocol grinding against royal authority before keys appeared, and the cuffs clicked up. And the sound was somehow louder than when they'd been applied, like an exclamation point on the end of a sentence nobody had seen coming. Grant flexed his wrists once, red marks visible where the metal had bitten in, then brought his arms back to his sides without ceremony. "Charles," addressed the crowd, his voice steady and deliberate. "This man acted on judgment forged in war, not defiance. The uniform you see here," he gestured toward the line of scarlet tunics, "is worn by those who carry the burden of protecting more than pageantry." He turned back to Grant, his voice dropping so only those nearest could hear, but somehow, everyone caught it anyway. "I owe you my life, Staff Sergeant Grant, twice over." The words settled over the courtyard like snow, quiet, but transformative. Charles gave a small nod, not the formal ceremonial acknowledgement, but something more personal, weighted with meaning that had nothing to do with protocol. Then, stepping back, he spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "The matter is closed. Return to your posts." For a few seconds, nobody moved. The moment felt too significant to simply end with people walking away. Then, the rhythm of the guard line resumed. Boots shifting, rifles adjusting, though they are still hummed with electricity. Grant stepped back into position, his boots finding the exact spot they'd occupied before, the weight of his rifle restored to his hands. His stance was as precise as it had been at the start of the morning, chin level, eyes forward, but now there was a subtle difference. The courtyard no longer looked at him as just another uniform in the line. They saw something else, someone else. The king remained nearby for a moment, speaking quietly with his officers. Then, turning once more toward the crowd, he let his voice carry across the stone and steel. "The crown stands because of men like this." The words were aimed at Grant, but meant for everyone within earshot. Several people in the crowd nodded quietly. A few even lowered their heads in respect. The earlier murmur of confusion had been replaced by something deeper, the kind of understanding that comes when you witness courage in its purest form. Grant didn't respond. He didn't need to. His presence, silent, immovable, unbroken, spoke louder than any words could have. The rifle rested against his shoulder in perfect alignment. The tall black burskin had cast shadows that hid any flicker of emotion, but he didn't need to show emotion. His actions had said everything necessary. Charles approached him one final time and extended his hand. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't protocol. It was simple human acknowledgement, brief enough to maintain formality, deliberate enough that every camera would catch it. The handshake lasted maybe 3 seconds. When it ended, the king stepped back and nodded once more, then turned to address the brigadier who had recommended the rest. "I want a full review of security protocols," Charles said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "And I want to understand why a man with Staff Sergeant Grant's record was questioned instead of consulted." The brigadier's face flushed slightly. "Yes, Your Majesty. Furthermore," Charles continued, "I want his threat assessment recommendations reviewed immediately. If he saw something we missed, we need to know what it was." Behind the barriers, the American tourist was shaking his head in amazement. Did we just watch a king apologize and fire his security chief in the same breath? His wife was still filming, though her hands were trembling slightly. "I think we just watched history." The king wasn't finished. He turned back to Grant one final time, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Staff Sergeant Grant, I'm instituting a new protocol effective immediately. Any member of the Household Division with your level of tactical experience will have direct access to voice security concerns. Regardless of chain of command, no soldier should face arrest for protecting the crown." A murmur of approval rippled through the veterans in the crowd. This wasn't just an apology. It was systemic change born from one man's courage to speak truth to power. "And I want a full honors review of your service record," Charles added. "It seems your contributions have been undervalued for far too long." As the ceremony continued, and the crowd began to drift toward the gates, conversations buzzed with a different energy than usual. People weren't just discussing what they'd seen, they were processing what it meant. A young journalist was already on her phone with her editor. "You need to clear the front page. I don't care what else we had planned. This is bigger than anything we've run this year." Near the rope line, the elderly veteran who'd called for Grant to speak was explaining something to his grandson. "That man didn't just save the king's life, boy. He showed everyone here what real courage looks like. Not the kind that seeks glory, but the kind that risks everything to do what's right." The American tourist who'd been filming put his phone away and turned to his wife. "I don't think we're going to see anything like that again." She nodded, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. "Good. I don't think my heart could take it." Behind them, the woman who'd been explaining ceremony to her daughter was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she said, "Sometimes the rules exist to protect something bigger than themselves. And sometimes breaking them is the most honorable thing you can do." Her daughter didn't roll her eyes this time. She just watched as Grant stood at his post, understanding that what she'd witnessed wasn't about pomp and circumstance at all. "Mom," she said quietly, "that man could have died saving the king, couldn't he, in Afghanistan? I mean..." Her mother nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. And he could have died here this week stopping that van, but he did it anyway. Why? Because some people are built to stand between danger and the rest of us, even when nobody's watching, even when nobody thanks them for it." A few feet away, the American tourist was reviewing the footage on his phone with his wife. "Look at this part," he said, pointing to the screen, right when the king shook his hand. "You can see the exact moment everything changed." His wife leaned in to watch. "He doesn't even smile. The guard, I mean. He just stands there like it's all part of the job." "Maybe because it is," her husband replied. "Maybe that's exactly what makes him a hero." It was about courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself with trumpets and fanfare, but stands quietly in the cold, ready to do what's necessary when the moment comes. And as the morning wore on, and the tourists eventually went home, Grant remained exactly where he belonged, silent, watchful, and absolutely unshakable. Because some things are worth standing for, no matter who tells you to move. Some things are worth the risk of handcuffs and arrest, and the end of everything you've worked for. Some things are worth speaking the truth, even when the truth is supposed to stay buried. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the truth sets everyone free.